First thing we're going to look at is the making tools. So what are the absolute essentials you need to put your models together? Cutting mat is very useful and they're pretty cheap, can be had in most sort of high street art stores, so wouldn't break the bank, well worth getting, just to keep everything organised really. Then when it comes to cutting, a scalpel or a craft knife, doesn't have to be anything fancy particular, but I do like a scalpel with a pointy blade. You can get curved blades as well. It's probably going to be your most used tool, so it is worth getting a decent scalpel and keeping the blades, again, plenty of blades so you can keep them sharp. Pair of cheap nail scissors. They're useful for all sorts of things, cutting up decals and what have you, nice pointy ones, and they're going to be pretty cheap from a high street pound shop. Side cutters, a lot of people get fancy model making side cutters to cut parts off the sprue. I don't think you need to do that. I generally use a knife, but if you do have any particularly tough bits, a cheap set of side cutters from the pound shop's tool section would be perfectly adequate. And while you're there, you could pick up a set of flat nose pliers. These are useful for bending bits of brass and pulling off all sorts of things. These ones don't have any grip, which is also quite handy for that kind of work. Right, when you've cut your parts off, you then need to glue them together, and so we'll come on to glues. The first glue, and I don't generally like the idea of promoting particular products, particular manufacturers, but I am going to in this case, and that's Tamiya Extra Thin Cement, which is fantastic glue and works by capillary action. So rather than your tube glue that you might use as a beginner or when you're first starting out, you hold the parts together. A dab of glue from the built-in brush will then seep into the joint and glue it from inside, rather than having to apply the glue and then sticking the parts together. You can use tube glue, and if you're going to use tube glue, I'd apply it with a toothpick rather than straight out the tube. This stuff, I say, is great. And Tamiya are going to love me saying that. What they're going to hate me saying is this. When this bottle runs out, don't buy another bottle of that, buy a bottle of this. Tamiya airbrush cleaner. It's exactly the same stuff, but that costs the same as that and holds 5 times as much as that. So top it up using the airbrush cleaner. Next glue is super glue, and I just use any old super glue really, to be honest. It can fog parts up. It's quite thin, it's not too thick. There's loads of different super glues out there, particularly if you go to a hobby shop, but this does me for most of the stuff. I don't have any fancy super glues. I used to use them, but I can't be bothered now. We'll apply this using a pin. So you put a dab of this on a bit of cardboard or a bit of plastic, and then use a pin to apply it to the parts. It's so thin that you can use by capillary action as well. And the third one I've got is some PVA glue, just cheap pound shop PVA glue. That's useful for all sorts of things. We'll come to that in detail later on. Right, with your parts glued, you need to hold them together sometimes. Pegs, cheap, super cheap. They'll do the job most of the time. They can hold all sorts of parts. These clamps, which you'll find in while you're buying your pegs in the pound shop, you'll find these in the tools section, and these are really useful. They'll hold a fuselage of an aircraft quite well. And these little jaws at the end can be moved about, so you can grab all sorts of shapes of that. They're very good. And bulldog clips. I find these useful for holding parts while I'm painting. Right, tweezers. So when you're in the pound shop, go to the beauty counter and get a set of pointy tweezers and a set of flat-headed tweezers. These are actually quite fancy ones, and they're really good. I do use them a lot, but cheap ones would be perfectly okay to get you started. One slightly more specialised tool is a pin vise, which is just a handle with different sized holes in it for holding all sorts of drill bits and things. This one is one of my most often used tools, and it's simply a pin vise with a needle stuck in the end. Useful for scribing, picking up small parts, really useful to probably my second most useful tool actually, and it's just a sewing needle fitted into a pin vise handle. It's not particularly expensive. This, I mentioned the super glue, applying with a pin. This is a long needle that I've put back to front, and I've clipped the end off, so it's just got a square end. in another pin vise, and that's my tool for applying super glue. With your pin vices, you probably want some drill bits, so a set like this is really useful. There's micro drill bits. The price on here, I've had this for many years, so I'm not sure it costs that anymore, but you'd be able to get these fairly cheaply, and they go from 2mm down to tiny, 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 which snap as soon as you look at them. But the middle sort of range ones, the 0.5s, the 0.7s, the 0.9s, they're all very useful. Back to the Poundland cheap stuff. Toothpicks or cocktail sticks. These are really useful for all sorts of things, so well worth having a good supply of those. Some rubber bands as well for holding parts together. And then we come to sanding. We've got just cheap sandpaper here. I say sandpaper, emery paper, and this comes in a fine, a medium, and a coarse. That's going to be fine for most stuff. You probably won't use the coarse very much, but that's pretty cheap, and that'll last a long time. And while you're at the beauty counter, pick up some of these. Blinging colours, but these are really handy little emery boards in different grades. I've not really used these. I've tended to use paper, but I'm going to give these a go because this kind of thing comes highly recommended, and these were super cheap. I do have a little file as well, which is a bit more specialised, but to be honest, don't really use it very much, so you could probably get away without. If, like me, your eyesight is starting to get a bit poor at a close distance, then you can also get reading glasses in a variety of strengths at the pound shop. You don't want to be wearing them all day long, but for close-up work, they can just give you the focus that you need when you're holding something very close. And finally, I think for now, filling. I don't tend to use much filler, and we'll come to tips and tricks and techniques later on when we start looking at the actual build. And that avoids using filler most of the time, but for small surface cracks and holes and joints, I find correction fluid is pretty useful, so we'll give that a go a little bit later on. That's about the basics for the building tools. Total outlay, probably about £10 maximum, I guess. And that will give you all you need to get started. Next time we'll be looking at paint and paint tools. Bye for now.